Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another installment of Muslim Skeptic Live. I'm your brother, Daniel Haqiqatjou, and today I have a very special episode for you, inshallah, where we'll have a guest who will, inshallah, discuss, I think, a very interesting and important issue, critical race theory. So we have brother Muhammad Hakim, who will inshallah join us, and he actually had a problem with some of the things that I had said in social media against critical race theory. And I'll explain what critical race theory is, I'll explain my problems with it, and I'll pretty much explain why I don't think Muslims should accept critical race theory. But brother Muhammad, he thinks I'm wrong on this. He, wrote an article, at least one or two articles against me on this issue of critical race theory. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to discuss this issue and really spell out what is the problem with critical race theory. Am I wrong? Is he wrong? Are both of us wrong? What's really the position that we should take on this? And so, alhamdulillah, recently I've been able to kind of technically work out how we can have people call in to Muslim Skeptic Live. So this is something that we'll do on a regular basis, inshallah, because I think it's good to have a discussion using voice as opposed to written text. And sometimes that can be more productive than a back and forth exchange through comments or posts or blog articles or what have you. So inshallah, once this discussion has concluded, I am writing a longer article with the details on critical race theory that will be published inshallah on muslimskeptic.com, and hopefully that can be used as a reference for some of the points that we're going to have in this conversation. And if brother Muhammad is able to make his point, I'm very open to revising what I think. Maybe he's thought of something that I haven't thought of, and then we can move from there. So inshallah, we'll see what comes of the discussion. So before we actually have brother Muhammad come on and speak, I think it's important to first understand what critical race theory is. And so critical race theory is something that really stems from 20th century thought. It's within the same kind of intellectual tradition, I would argue, as Foucault, for example, or Edward Said, or many of the post-colonial, decolonial thinkers that we have seen within Western academia. The main founders of critical race theory are two individuals, two legal scholars, Derek Bell and Richard Delgado. So these two individuals, they're lawyers, legal theorists, and in the mid-1980s, they proposed this kind of idea of critical race theory. And what is the main component of this idea? It's this idea that we have to look at racism as something structural. We have to look at structural systems in order to understand how racism works. We have to look at the legal system. We have to look at the economic system. We have to look at media. We have to look at culture. We have to look at all of these factors together in order to truly understand how white power oppresses minorities, specifically blacks and Latinos and Hispanics. This was what the two minorities that they were mainly concerned with when Derek Bell and Delgado were writing. And so this is the main idea. And why this is significant is because there's I would say a naive, whitewashed understanding of what racism is. And all of this I actually agree with, right? I agree that this idea that, America is post-racial. America has left racism. behind, and this is a thing of the past, and now we're so enlightened because look, how could we not be a post-racial society if you have a black president, Barack Hussein Obama? This proves that America is so far beyond the kind of its racist past. And what this whitewashed understanding of racism really depends on is this idea that racism is kind of an individual phenomenon. It's an individual, you have racist individuals who are operating in an otherwise good system. You have racist individuals operating in a good system. So there's nothing wrong with American legal structure. There's nothing wrong with the judicial system. There's nothing wrong with, the academic institutions. These are all neutral institutions, secular institutions, and it's just racist individuals who are operating, who inflict racism and subjugation of blacks and other minorities. And so what Derek Bell and Delgado and the other critical race theorists point out is that this is very simplistic. This does not capture the true extent or the true nature of how Western society, white European civilization, has constructed an entire governmental system, social system, academic system that in its very nature subjugates these different races and oppresses them for the benefit of the white race. And so this kind of analysis is reminiscent of Foucault, hermeneutics of suspicion, right? This idea that is coming even from as far back as Friedrich Nietzsche within Western philosophical thought, this idea that what we see on the surface is not really the reality, right? What we see on the surface of these institutions and these laws and all of this we have to be suspicious of underlying power that is manipulating the system for its own benefit, right? So this kind of thinking, which I guess is most powerfully expressed in Foucault and others, is the same intellectual tradition, I would argue, that the critical race theorists are operating within. And so they have this kind of attitude towards the structure. It's important to look at the structure and not think that, this is something that, racism is the, random white supremacist, who will give you a dirty look in the supermarket, or the random KKK member who is going to burn a cross or commit a violent act against a black community member or neighbor, or so on and so forth. No, if we limit ourselves to this kind of individualist understanding of racism, then we're missing the bigger picture. We're missing that there are structures that are holding minorities down. And again, I think that this is a kind of critique that is useful. I think that it has benefits. I think that it is very applicable to Muslims. Muslims in the West, black Muslims in the West, and non-Muslims as well, and then also Muslims in the East, because this kind of analysis of structures and law and policies, and this kind of suspicion that we are suspicious of the colonizer, the colonizer that's coming and taking over Muslim lands and telling the Muslim world that, no, this is for your own benefit. We're simply bringing civilization. We're bringing advancement. We're bringing technology. We're bringing reform. We're bringing progress. Being suspicious of this and analyzing, okay, what is really happening? What is really the benefit to the colonizer? And how are Muslims being manipulated to leave their religious beliefs, to leave Islam, to secularize, to liberalize. How is this manipulation happening, and what ideas are driving this? So that kind of analysis, I think, is well received. I think that we should take that seriously. But there are problems. There are problems where if we adopt this philosophy, it's going to lead us down a road that can conflict with Islam very directly. And so this is what we have to be aware of, and this is what I'll explain. Just to give you an example, a concrete example of structural racism, because I gave you the example of the individual racist, the KKK member, or like the racist individual. Talking about on the level of law, my favorite example is when it comes to the minimum sentencing requirements for different drugs, different illegal drugs within the United States. So within the 1980s, early in the 1980s, you had this kind of drug policy that was enforced that said that there was a crack epidemic, basically. Just like today, there's an opioid epidemic within America. In the late 1970s and 1980s, you had a crack epidemic. And so crack was ravishing the black community. And so there was the new policies that were put into force that made the minimum sentence for crack possessing crack or selling it 100 times more than possessing or selling powdered cocaine. Okay, so if you don't know the difference between crack and cocaine, crack is also cocaine. It's the same drug. It's just in a crystallized or a rock form. Okay, and you smoke crack. Whereas powdered cocaine is something that you can, snort, or it's something that you can inject. You can inject it. And the important thing, though, is that, well, why? Why is this form of the drug, crack, penalized so much more severely than the powdered form? Why? What's the difference there? They're both equally dangerous. Some argue that cocaine is even in powdered form is more dangerous than smoking crack, because if you can inject cocaine, that is, they say, much more dangerous for the body. So why is this differential? And then what critical race theorists pointed out was that when it comes to crack, this is a drug that's primarily used by blacks. And powdered cocaine is stereotypically and commonly used by whites. So then this, if you just concentrate on the law doesn't say that we're going to punish blacks more and we're going to criminalize black drug use to a higher extent than whites. There's nothing explicitly racist within the law that is written in words. There's nothing like that. Rather, you have to understand the social context. You have to understand the legislation context and the process with which this law came into effect. That will disproportionately affect the black community because that happens to be the drug that is being used within the black community more than this other form that is primarily used by whites. So you've created this situation where the black community is being disproportionately punished and being hammered by the legal system. A high, ridiculous percentage of black youth being put behind bars for possessing, as little as 5 grams of crack can get you 5 years of prison time. Okay, so is this fair when they're the same amount of crack? To get 5 years of prison time for powdered cocaine, you'd have to have 500 grams. 500 grams. So that's 100 times different, right? The penalty for crack versus cocaine. And so this is why, so much of the black community in America has been just ravaged, just completely destroyed by this particular drug policy and other policies many other policies that will disproportionately affect the black community, even though there's nothing explicitly racist in the law. Okay, you've created what's happened, okay, this idea that we're in a post-racial society and post-Jim Crow, we've kind of progressed as a society, and now no one, this is, the structure of the law itself is not racist. This is an illusion. This is an illusion. And this is the kind of analysis that critical race theorists will do. And so up to this point, everything is fine. Like, I think that this is a good analysis. I think that it's applicable and accurate in many different contexts. I think you can take the same kind of analysis and apply it to the Muslim world, apply it to colonialism, apply it to the East, apply it to all these different parts of the world where white European powers have subjugated an entire race, ethnicity, religion. And so this is the kind of analysis that we should be able to do. But, and this is where I get into the problems with critical race theory, there are aspects of the theory that are problematic, to say the least. And the problem is that if a Muslim accepts critical race theory as a whole, or a Muslim's mindset is dictated by this theoretical structure, including all of these different aspects of it, this has the potential to cause problems in faith, problems Islamically. And so we have to recognize this. And this is a kind of critique and a kind of argument that I make about all of these modernist theories, all of the modern intellectual academic theories that are coming from, especially the ones that are coming from secular academia. Okay? This is the same argument I make about feminism. This is the same argument I make about liberalism. This is the same argument I make about scientism. What I note when I point out with all of these different ideologies, theories, what have you, is that yes, they have correct aspects and good points. Even feminism, which I hate more than anything, okay, they have correct, they will point to correct instances of injustice, correctly point out that yes, this injustice exists. They'll do that. But it's a whole package, right? That's not the only thing. One correct identification of injustice, and then a bunch of other things that are problematic, a bunch of other things that will negatively impact the Muslim's faith. So we have to be aware of this, because if you just wholesale advocate a certain ideology and you're not aware of these subtle problems, these subtle issues, then you're essentially creating a fitna. You're creating a fitna for the community. You're creating a test, or you're creating a situation where people's faith is tested and they're not even realizing it. Okay. Social justice activism is another great example. Okay. Yes, there are certain aspects of social justice activism that are correct in their opposition to certain injustices in society. Of course, who will deny certain things? The problem is with the rest of it that you have to also accept as a package deal. Yes, for example, this is the argument I make with Black Lives Matter. Yes, Black Lives Matter has been hijacked. I mean, that's my opinion, and I think it's a well-justified opinion. Black Lives Matter started as an opposition to police brutality and the justice system that disproportionately targets the Black American community. There's no denying this. There is no denying this. Okay? And this whole, oh, well, it's just a couple of bad apples in the police force that are killing Black men, killing Black children. It's just a couple of bad apples. And then, I mean, this is where the critical race theory comes in and is making great points that, no, it's not a couple of bad apples. It's a whole system that tolerates those bad apples and allows them to operate within the judicial system, the legal system, the police force. That's the problem. Yes, they're bad apples, but they're operating in context of an entire system. So this was great. This is exactly the kind of correct analysis of the situation that Black Lives Matter was putting forth. But then what else has become mixed into it? Well, now we have to identify other minority groups, okay, such as LGBT, now such as transsexuals, transgender, and so on and so forth. Okay? And we have to fight for their rights, and we have to accept that they're also an oppressed minority. And so all of these assumptions go into that, and you have this entire package that you now have to accept. Okay, if you're on board with Black Lives Matter, then you also need to be on board with this the Pride Parade. You also need to be on board with reproductive rights. You also need to be on board with XYZ, etc. This is a problem, especially when the XYZ is contradicting Islam, is contrary to Islamic values and faith, right? So the same thing with critical race theory. So what specifically? A few things here, and we can get into more discussion with Brother Muhammad when he comes on. My biggest issue with, two big issues, and then a few smaller issues. One, critical race theory is perspectival. It advocates perspectivalism. What do I mean by this? Perspectivalism, another term for it is standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology. It's the idea that, which again, this is the problem. It's true to some extent, but if you go too far, then it becomes very problematic for a Muslim. This idea that you really can't speak about certain issues unless you are part of that race, or part of that group, or part of that minority. Okay? And so this is what some of the critical race theorists said. Bell, Delgado, others, they said that, look, and again, this was correct to as far as it went, that you have all of the legal scholars commenting on racism and the racism of the law. They're white men. They're not minorities. They're benefiting from the current status quo, the racist status quo. And so they're not going to be inclined to understand how racism within the law, this structural phenomenon, is negatively impacting minorities. They haven't lived that experience, so they're not going to be able to properly judge. Okay, so that's, I think, a very fair point. If you don't have the experience, how can you comment on the experience of others? This is a fair point. The problem is when you take it too far. When you take it too far and say that, no, on any issue of racism, you cannot speak unless you are a minority. Okay? You cannot speak about racism. You cannot speak about these laws. You cannot speak about... And we see this advocated by many of the activists in the political discourse today, where people will be shouted down. People will be told to shut up. They'll be told that you, just by speaking, right? This is happening on university campuses. Just by speaking on this issue as a non-minority, you are perpetuating oppression and racism. Because you as a person, your identity, you're not a minority. Okay? You don't have the correct standpoint. You don't have the correct perspective to be able to opine, to even have a voice. Okay? So this is being used to silence different kinds of critics or different kinds of speakers, academics on these racial issues. And I don't think that's the correct approach. And I think that if you take it too far, and we do see activists take it too far, then it leads to problems in faith. Why? Because you can say things like, well, if you look at Islamic scholarship, most of them were a particular race, right? Like, look at the main collectors of hadith. Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah. Most of them, if not all, are Persian in ethnicity. They're Persian ethnically. So does that mean that those compilers of hadith or those scholars who are from these particular races, their material, their scholarship is not relevant to the Muslim community today, or to Muslims who are not those ethnicities, who are not Persian, who are not Arab, who are not, Central Asian and so forth. If you take standpoint epistemology and perspectivalism too far, that's the conclusion that you get. And you see activists and some of the academics who fall within this kind of critical race theory school of thought, these are the arguments that they make. And then some of them take it even further. They say that these prophets, the Anbiya, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's not black, he's not Hispanic, he's not a woman, right? He doesn't have the right identity. So in what sense is revelation that he is delivering, in what sense is that applicable to me? In what sense is that relevant? How can he say what is right and wrong? Wa'yadu billah. Like, that's the kind of mindset that you go down if you take standpoint epistemology to its logical conclusion, to its final end. So in summary, that's one big issue is perspectivalism, and we can talk more with Brother Muhammad on that. The second issue is opposition to hierarchy. The opposition to hierarchy. And Derek Bell, the main founder of critical race theory, is explicit on this. He says, he defines, I'll read you the quote, he defines what critical race theory is about. He says that it's an experientially grounded, oppositionally expressed, and transformatively aspirational concern with race and other socially constructed hierarchies. Okay? This is what critical race theory is attacking, is hierarchy. Because the idea is that when you have a hierarchical system, that those at the top are going to socially construct this idea of race, of different races, and some races below other races in order to oppress them and to take advantage of them. Excuse me. Sorry, dropped my phone. So this idea of hierarchy is part and parcel of critical race theory. And you can see clearly that this is something that is going to conflict with Islam. Why? Because hierarchy is something that God has created. There are different levels in terms of wealth, in terms of all kinds of fadl, favor and benefits that certain people have over others. This is a part of the creation of Allah, and it's a test, right? The haves and the have-nots are the people who have, the people who have been favored in terms of wealth, they've been favored in terms of social status, they've been favored in terms of good looks, attractiveness. Are they going to use those in the correct way? Are they going to follow the guidelines and the commandments of their creator who has given them these benefits? Are they going to be grateful? And then those who are have-nots, who don't have the status, who don't have the wealth and the beauty and so on and so forth, are they going to be patient? Are they going to have sabr? Are they going to live, again, according to what God has commanded, or are they going to be resentful? Are they going to blame God? Are they going to put the fault on others for their situation in life? So this is the kind of world that Allah has created, and it's hierarchical. And nowhere in Islam says that hierarchy is something that has to be abolished, that we need a perfectly egalitarian society where everyone is at the same level. Okay? So we have to recognize this. Now, that doesn't justify oppression. None of that in Islam justifies any kind of racial oppression or abuse or subjugation or anything that we see arise out of Western imperialism, colonialism, and so forth. None of that is a justification of that. All that is being said is that hierarchy is something that Islam acknowledges, but hierarchy can be just. Hierarchy can be something that is endorsed. You can have a very just society, adl, okay, right? This is the idea, adl, that is hierarchical. You won't have perfect equality between everyone in such a society, and this is what the kind of society we see with the Anbiya, the prophets, right? In the society of the Prophet ﷺ, this was the case. You had rich Sahaba, you had poor Sahaba, you had Sahaba that had political power, you had other Sahaba that weren't connected to political power in any capacity at all, and it wasn't seen as an injustice. Okay? And it wasn't considered an injustice because the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran, Allah in the Quran, did not define it as injustice. But again, if you have this sense of opposition to all hierarchy, then you're going to have a problem with this. And I've met Muslims who have a problem with this. I've met Muslims who they have shubuhat, they have doubts because they wonder, well, they've been basically trained to think in this kind of way that all hierarchy is bad. All hierarchy is unjust. All power is bad. All political power has to be viewed suspiciously. Okay? This is called mixing things and confusing things. Just because some instances of political power are bad, political power that we see today, political power that we've seen within the West, just because that's bad doesn't mean that all political power is bad. We can't say that because the Prophet ﷺ wielded political power. The companions, the Khulafa al-Rashidun, wielded political power. Okay? And the idea of political power, the Khilafah, is a part of Islam. It's an important part of Islam. That's political power. If we have to oppose political power no matter what, then that means that we have to reject all of these things. So this creates problems in faith. Okay, so this is the basic argument. And there's other things as well that we can talk about. Like, for example, I think that critical race theory, in line with its Foucauldian roots, is liberal in the sense that it champions emancipation and freedom in a secular sense. Okay, and so that makes it liberal, and so we can talk about that. But yeah, these are the main kinds of points that I have against critical race theory. And again, it's not that the whole theory we have to throw it out, but we just have to recognize that these are problems that prevent us from accepting this wholesale, accepting it and advocating for it. Okay, so inshallah, now let me get Brother Muhammad on the line. Just bear with me here as we give him a call. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me? Brother Muhammad, you're on the line. You're live right now.
Okay. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, I bear witness that there's no God worthy of worship but Allah, and I further bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. First and foremost, thank you, Brother Daniel, for inviting me on your program to address this issue as to whether Muslims should adopt or accept critical race theory. And it's my basic intention on your program today that Black Muslims in particular in neighborhoods that are detrimentally impacted from pro-Black codes and a litany of other racially discriminatory policies that were systematically designed to inhibit the socioeconomic mobility should accept the basic premises of critical race theory in order to be effective in da'wah in their own communities, in order to propagate Islam in a way that it actually resonates with the political realities that people are facing and empower them to rise above their contentions. Now, you gave your own historical analysis of how critical race theory was formulated and adopted, and I would like to provide an alternative historical analysis for people to compare it to. So,
well, can you before you get into that, sorry to cut you off, before you get into the analysis, can you just give an introduction of like what you do and basically how you came to adopt critical race theory or advocate for it or why it's relevant to you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from a neighborhood in Chicago, Southside Chicago, by the name of South Shore. It's a neighborhood that's sort of replete with gang violence, drug economy, an environment in which, many people don't expect to live past 21, or they'll end up either dead or in prison. That's the type of neighborhood that I'm from. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, looking at critical race theory, you can see direct policies in place by the Chicago Housing Authority, by the Illinois government, in order to create this condition in the community of wholesale poverty and social neglect. And so for me, reading the works of Derek Bell, reading the works of Delgado, it sort of provides an analysis of how sort of structural racism was able to maintain itself post-Jim Crow with sort of dire repercussions on Black life. Now, in terms of what I do, I am a human rights attorney. I do a little bit of criminal defense work. I do prisoners' rights. I do work extensively with Black Muslim incarcerated prisoners who are involved in litigation for human rights abuses by the Department of Corrections. And I also work extensively in terms of, Islamic outreach, in terms of Black communities, talking to brothers about Islam, talking to brothers about Malcolm X.
Okay, mashallah. Okay. That's great. So you're really doing a lot of good work, mashallah. So now can you tell me what you were going to say, your alternative
so critical race theory was pioneered by, as you correctly pointed out, African-American legal scholar Derek Bell. And it's really a critique of the ways that structural racism was able to maintain itself post-Jim Crow in an era in which the discriminatory legislation be unconstitutional. And so Derek Bell's primary audience, and I'm going to get into your critique of a standpoint epistemology, but Derek Bell's, his primary audience were, Black people who were suffering in the aftermath of Jim Crow. And so it's something that fundamentally deals with African-American legal studies, African-Americans, and, the plight for rectifying de facto structural racism. Now, I'll give it to you. A lot of your analysis and your assessment of critical race theory is actually more on point and more accurate than a lot of what I've been seeing from other Muslim public intellectuals. In the context of my article, I was critiquing a lecture by the name of Abdullah Andalusia titled "The Middle Way," and I outlined, the problematic contention that I had with some of what he said in that article. Another lecture of his, and as well as another brother from London by the name of Hamza. Now, I agree that there can be to critical race theory, but the fundamental premises of it is not something that, Muslims should take any issue with at all. And so is it your contention that, adopting a political analysis by Black legal scholars demonstrating how structural racism shifted in its modus operandi, it contravenes upon fundamental principles of Islam? Is that your contention?
Well, it depends on what you're defining as the fundamental principles. I don't think that it's contrary to Islam to recognize structural racism. I think that Muslims should recognize structural racism. I think Muslims should recognize how the law is being used in this kind of way. So that's not, but I think that there are other aspects that are fundamental to critical race theory that are problematic and will do pose those problems. So it depends on what you're defining as fundamental.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to an article by contemporary critical race theories, Tommy Curry. He wrote an article called "Canonizing the Critical Race Artifice," which to me provides a basic, fundamental premise of what critical race theory, what the theory is, what the foundations are. He says that critical race theory is the proposition that there's been no linear progress in civil rights. You agree with that?
Yes, I agree. I think I think that there's the kind of post-racial idea of American society is completely false.
Yeah. And he also indicates that the pattern of racial oppression in the past has created a huge Black underclass as the accumulation of disadvantage were passed on from generation to generation. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah. Can you repeat the last part?
Sure. A pattern of racial discrimination in the past has created a huge Black underclass as the accumulation of disadvantages were passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah, of course. of course, no doubt
So
about it.
these are what I would say are the basic premises of critical race theory, and far from being, influenced by Foucault or some sort of liberal academic tradition, I would say that much of Derek Bell's criticism of the failure of the civil rights movement to provide adequate redress to structural racism is coming from individuals, Black Muslims like Malcolm X, who also made similar criticisms.
Yes. So I, the things that I was saying about standpoint epistemology, there are critical race theorists, major ones, who are pushing that kind of view, and that's what critical race theory has been criticized for from other legal scholars. And the source that I would use, like, I haven't read the article that you cited. My main source of knowledge for critical race theory is, the work of Derek Bell, and then also Delgado and Stefancic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but they wrote the book literally on critical race theory called Critical Race Theory: An Introduction, where Delgado goes through all these different points, and one of the main things that he is emphasizing is this kind of standpoint epistemology and the ability. Again, it's true to an extent, but when you take it too far, I think that you have to be able to judge a theory or an ideology partly by its fruits. And so would you say, for example, that Black Lives Matter, the current movement, would you say that that's influenced by, to what extent is that influenced by critical race theory, in your opinion?
So number one, I'm not with the. I agree with the phrase Black Lives Matter. I think Black Lives Matter movement. They're influenced a lot by intersectional politics, and I would say that there are critical Tommy Curry who critique intersectionality, and you don't necessarily have to adopt a critical race lens to see how structural racism continues to manifest itself in a post-Jim Crow era and adopt other, leftist sexual politics. That's not an inherent result of critical race theory. And I feel like what you're critiquing are certain accesses of critical race theory, but not the foundational premises that are of much benefit to Muslims and what Muslims can accept.
Well, I mean, intersectionality, you mentioned it, but the person who coined intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, she's also a Black legal scholar and is considered one of the main figures of critical race theory. And she's a Black, I don't know if she self-identifies as a feminist, but intersectionality is entirely her analysis. And she's considered a critical race theorist. But I think that I mean, it's fine. Like, it's going to become a discussion about where do we draw the line, because I think you agree that perspectivalism and standpoint epistemology are contrary to Islam. Do you agree with that?
I think the excesses of standpoint epistemology and hierarchy, or all opposition to all forms of hierarchy, or the principles of Islam. But in terms of, here's my thing. And you let me know if this is, an argument from standpoint epistemology. We have a situation in which critical race theory was pioneered by African-American legal scholars, realities of Black life in a post-Jim Crow era. And so you have Muslims from London in communities not directly impacted by the legacy of Black codes, not directly impacted by the legacy of Jim Crow, and then making very amateurish critiques of critical race theory, saying that any form or mention of racism is a reinforcement of racism. They're saying that, about racism, what about poor white people? And these are arguments that I take major issue with.
So I'm not going to stand by, like, I have to see exactly what is being critiqued, but I don't stand by what others say. I'm just concerned about, like, what I'm putting out there, because the whole reason we're having this discussion is because you kind of lumped me in with a broader group. And I mean, you make a fair point. Like, I haven't written anything substantive or spoken substantively about critical race theory, my problems with it. I've just made some remarks that are offhand, that I don't think that this is a thing that Muslims should adopt wholesale. And so it's a fair point to say, well, explain yourself. You can't just put that out there and not give some kind of justification. So that's a fair critique, and I want to have this episode dedicated to it. I want to write more extensively on it as well, and I want to get your feedback and your point so that we can have this kind of productive dialogue.
Sure.
But so, go ahead.
Back to Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality.
Sure.
There's differences of opinions in terms of scholarship. I'm just reading an article that I'll cite for you. It's called "Liberal Co-option and the Challenges of Black Studies under Intersectional Axiom" by another Tommy Curry, who's the head of a pioneer in the field of critical race theory. And he publishes, a volume of work criticizing intersectionality and why intersectionality, for example, fails to take into account how lynching was justified, sexualized rhetoric against heterosexual Black men vis-a-vis white women. And so there are people within critical race theory who have differences of opinion. There are people within critical race theory who are critical of intersectionality. And so my basic intention is that Muslims, there are foundational premises within critical race theory that we should have no issue with accepting.
Well, I agree with that. There are aspects of all these different theories. You can say that there are aspects of communism that Muslims can accept. There are aspects of capitalism. Any kind of modern theory, you're going to have aspects of it that you can accept and aspects of it that you cannot accept. My issue or my concern, and this is a theme that I return to again and again, is that when theories as a whole are being advocated on the level of community discourse, and you're mentioning, amateurness on one side in terms of rejection, and there are others that I can cite who are amateurish in their acceptance. I'm not referring to you, but I mean others who are accepting the theory and not really understanding the underlying ramifications or implications of what they're accepting and what they're advocating. Social justice is one example. Black Lives Matter is another example, where a large segment of the Muslim community and speakers and imams are pushing certain ideologies very amateurly, right? Without an understanding of what those theories actually are and without having deeply thought about the implications of those theories. So I think the amateurness can go both ways. But do you think that a Muslim can oppose structural racism and recognize how racism continues to operate on a policy level, on a legislative level, and fight against that without being a critical race theorist?
Cut off.
No?
Cut off. I couldn't hear your last. Can you repeat your last statement?
Oh, sorry. Do you think that a Muslim can oppose structural racism without being a critical race theorist?
Oh, I would say that in order to be adequately informed about how structural racism operates, you should turn to key authors in the field who have dissected structural racism, how it shifted in terms of its modus operandi, and you should consult works like Derek Bell. I personally don't go around calling myself, a critical race theorist. That's not something that you have to do. But of course, Muslims should look at structural racism. They should look in terms of how it operates, and they should be opposed on an Islamic basis.
Okay, it should be opposed on an Islamic basis?
Structural racism should be opposed on an Islamic basis.
Oh, structural racism. Okay. All right. It seems like we agree on that, because if you can oppose structural racism and not necessarily call yourself a critical race theorist or not be beholden to, many of the figures within critical race theory, then, I think that we agree. I think that do you agree with that or no?
So what I do want to push back on is your attempt to paint critical race theory as a liberal, secular Western mode of thought or mode of knowledge. And I'm going to point to all of the ways in which critical race theory was actually a critique of the left and of leftists, of liberal political thought. The sort of characterization of black political thought, it does not fit into this left-right binary, because critical race theory, it contains critiques of how both the left and the right have failed to grapple with structural racism in a post-Jim Crow world. And so one of the primary ways in which critical race theory functions as a critique of liberalism and the left is, again, if you go to Derek Bell's article, Masters, Derek Bell states that leftist influences made it so that the NAACP did not meet the needs of black communities who wanted, during the time of school desegregation, black people, black communities, they simply wanted better schools, more resources. They didn't necessarily want integrated into white schools. But he says that white leftist lawyers, as well as various liberals, they made it so that integration was pursued as a strategy. So that's one way in which critical race theory in Derek Bell's analysis functions as a critique of the left and liberals. Secondly, Derek Bell indicates that white liberals utilize legal arguments to convince the Supreme Court to outlaw racial segregation because it would hurt America's image in the Cold War, and not because racial discrimination was inherently wrong. And so, lastly, critical race theory, from the founding fathers of liberalism, from John Locke, who was an investor in the transatlantic slave trade, from Rousseau, who didn't consider black people to be part of the social contract, and from Immanuel Kant, who wrote a treatise on the proper way to beat black slaves while simultaneously advocated for his categorical imperative.
Yeah.
I've been very critical of the left, the liberals, and I think it's very inappropriate to just put critical race theory in a box and just say, this is a Western liberal concept which we have no need of. And I think Muslims should definitely be informed by the insights of critical race theory.
Well, we agree that critical race theory has certain insights that are necessary and useful and powerful, and we should apprise ourselves of those insights in accordance with Islam, because that's our ultimate metric for deciding what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what is truth and what is falsehood. But what I will characterize critical race theory as liberal for several reasons. I'll definitely criticize it or characterize it as secular. It's a secular theory. It's a secular analysis of power. It doesn't involve God. It doesn't involve scripture. It doesn't involve any kind of organized religion in its analysis. And many of the main critical race theorists were non-religious and were secular. And I mean, one of the biggest examples, I think that the most popular or the most influential critical race theorist today is arguably Tennessee Coates. If you're aware of his writing, and he's written books and articles. Tennessee Coates.
Yeah.
So, and he's very...
The critical race theorist?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, of course. I think he is. And I don't think he takes on that label. I'd have to go check all his work, but he's definitely seen within that school of thought. And he makes these kinds of legal critiques of post-Jim Crow America and American society. And so, but one of the things that he says is that he's very openly atheist or agnostic. And he says that, look, my concern is black bodies. Black bodies are what are being oppressed, are being chained, are being, whipped, and so on and so forth. Black bodies, and I don't have a concern for the black soul, because as far as I'm concerned, it's not something that we know to exist, the soul, the immaterial soul. So just as an example of the kind of secular thought that comes from these academics. Now you might want to argue that, he's not a real critical race theorist. He's not a real one. That's debatable. We can argue that. But the main point of that.
I'll respond to you by saying that the basic political analysis that critical race theory offers, which is the position of structural racism from de jure to de facto, which is being cognizant of the ways in which structural racism manifests itself in contemporary society. I agree that that should be analyzed from an Islamic perspective and an Islamic, agenda to do that. However, what I'm simply critical of is sort of what I've seen, and I've seen this in other lectures. I'm going to go get, I want to get to addressing a Facebook post that you made. But before I go to that, what I'm critiquing is a very lazy engagement of individuals with critical race theory, or just like this is some Western liberal nonsense.
I don't speak for other people, right? I'm speaking for myself.
The proper analysis and the proper inclusion that we can come to is, okay, how are we going to analyze structural racism, the transition of structural racism from de jure to de facto? How are we going to address the legacy of Jim Crow and the residue of black codes from an Islamic perspective? So how would you say that we should address the legacy of black codes from an Islamic perspective?
Well, we can look at all these sociological factors. I think the most important thing is that we have to define what racism is itself, and how do we do that from an Islamic standpoint and from the standpoint of the Quran and the Sunnah. I think that's the first question, and this is an issue that I have, because a lot of the way that racism is defined and used in the Muslim discourse is just borrowing from a very secular standpoint. Okay, and this is why this is the root of the issue. If you have a theory that is coming from the secular mind, then it's going to definitely have problems with it. Okay, and this stems from our metaphysics. Because truth is from Allah, truth is from revelation, truth is from the Quran and the Prophet, peace be upon him. That's where truth stems from. So if you have something that is completely detached and unconnected to that, by its very nature, it's going to be suffused with falsehood. It's going to be suffused and permeated with incorrect ideas and incorrect thought. So as Muslims, we have to be skeptical of anything that is being produced by the secular mind, the mind that is detached from Allah and His Messenger. We have to be skeptical of that, right? So when racism,
for you based upon your statement.
Say it again.
I have another question for you based upon your statement.
Okay, go ahead.
So in the black people were forcibly taken from Africa, many of them from Islamic civilizations such as Mali, such as Songhai. During the course of 400 years of slavery, there was a situation in which black people were not able to transgenerationally transmit Islamic knowledge. It was, written in the law that black people, could not read. So we definitely couldn't read the Quran, couldn't read, the books of Hadith. And so in the period immediately after slavery, majority of African Americans were forcibly Christianized. They were all subsumed into Christianity. Nevertheless, they produced thinkers who addressed issues of, structural racism. And so my first question is, can somebody who is not Muslim produce accurate political analysis concerning structural racism?
Yes.
Entirely dismiss it.
No, I don't disagree that the secular mind can come to truths and can arrive at certain truths independently of Islam. But it's going to be full of other problems. It's going to be full of other issues and falsehoods. Islam doesn't deny that wisdom can be found in other cultures or other religions. The problem is that it's surrounded by and embedded within falsehood. And so the discerning Muslim mind, the discerning Muslim heart has to recognize what is true as truth and what is false as falsehood. And this is what we ask. It requires guidance from Allah, guidance from our Creator to be able to recognize those kinds of distinctions.
And so, again, what I would advocate, Muslims, people who are beholding to the tradition of Islam, of course, should non-Muslim, black sociologists, critical race theorists, and then learn and conceive of ways in which to address the very real realities of structural racism from an Islamic perspective. But the very basic premises that there's a continuation of structural racism, the very basic, contention of structural racism, that structural racism has created a huge black underclass. Those issues aren't something that Muslims should have any problem accepting whatsoever. And when you do, of course, many critical race theorists, they aren't Muslim, and so of course they have basic conclusions, secular in nature. But of course, we shouldn't just wholly and entirely dismiss them, which I know you're not advocating. But we should, we should address it as like a serious concern. We should give them dawah, and we should learn how, and we should actually actualize how to combat structural racism and the continuation of white supremacy from the paradigm of Islam.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that we can benefit from insights and research of others, including secular thinkers, but the identification of injustice, we should be able to do it ourselves, and we should kind of be embarrassed if non-Muslims are outdoing us in fighting injustice.
I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, so that's what I believe, and the only thing that I will raise the red flag is just to make sure that when we are learning from others, that we're not adopting, the underlying philosophy, the underlying ideology of these non-Islamic, non-Muslim.
To my knowledge, Derek Bell was a Christian, a very devout Christian, but just like I wouldn't say, Dr. Martin Luther King, you were advocating for, combating the triple evils of racism and classism and militarism, but you believe in Trinitarian Christianity. Therefore, I'm going to reject what you say. That's not the mentality that I have. And so, it all up, we're in agreement in terms of utilizing and producing Islamic scholarship and producing and actualizing Islam in opposition to forms of white supremacy and addressing structural racism.
Sure. All right, so I think for the most part, we're in agreement. One of the other things that I want to say about liberalism, though, is that I'm aware that you have a lot of critical race theorists, but also others who will criticize the white liberals, the founders of liberal secular thought, such as John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Hobbes, Mill, so forth. But what I've noticed, and what's the reality, is that you can critique an ideology but still be suffering from it. So, and when we see this that's one of the insights of critical race theorists, because they say that these people and these institutions think that they're not racist, but they're really racist, right? Even though they think that they're not. Similarly, you can think that you're not liberal and still be liberal, right? And this is what I've noticed, because the thing is that if your philosophy and ideology is grounded in this ultimate value of emancipation and freedom as an ultimate end, then that is something that is liberal. That is what the core essence of liberalism actually is, and this is what all the white liberals would.
So,
right, let me finish the point, and then I'll let you respond. So this is the main bedrock of liberal thinking, is that emancipation is the ultimate value. Why? Because there is no such thing as a heaven. There is no such thing as a hell. Our situation in this material world is all that there is. And so the only value that we can find is value in human liberation. And so what does that liberation mean? Well, then there are different theorists who will say different things about what liberation actually what constitutes liberation. But if you have a theory and an ideology and a movement that is dedicated to this as an ultimate value, then it's liberal by definition. Liberal in terms of liberationist, emancipationist. And this is something that contravenes Islam, because liberation is not our primary value. In fact, Islam means submission. It means to submit. And being a slave is actually the highest position. The Prophet ﷺ is Abdullah. He's the slave of Allah. And so that's something that we aspire to as Muslims. And I mean, this is a prolonged discussion, but you see that there's a very clear contradiction there that we have to be aware of. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I would emphatically disagree with you that this sort of politics is inherent stance of critical race theories. There's an author by an African American of critical race theories by the name of Saidiya Hartman, and what she indicates and what she criticizes, in fact, is the fact that after the end of the so-called end of slavery, that black people had no. Instead of the black people were integrated into liberalism and integrated into the liberal power structure, and they were not allowed any form of politics or any form of political expression outside of being subsumed into the liberal structures of white America. And so this is something that they're highly critical of.
But what are they striving for, right? I acknowledge that they're critical of liberal thinkers, and you mentioned how you have critiques of Kant, Locke, and so forth. I don't deny that they have criticisms of the left, they have criticisms of liberal philosophers, but that doesn't mean that the underlying ideology has not been significantly influenced by that liberationist secular thought. That's the point that I'm making.
And again, that I'm making is that in the era after slavery, black people were not allowed any mode of political expression outside of liberalism, and they were subsumed within it. They striving for, of course, there are some, there are a multiplicity of black political thought. Black political thought is a rich tradition. There are black Muslims who they're striving for Islam. They don't want to be part of the liberal structures of white America or the institution of it, and so that's what I advocate and that's what I believe in.
All right, yeah. So
I wanted to address a certain post that you made, if you're okay with that.
Go ahead.
I made a post about a Marine who was about to blow up a mosque, somehow converted to Islam.
Right.
The Quran, and he converted to Islam, and you said, you know, he wasn't convinced to convert to Islam because he read critical race theory. If you're giving dawah to an individual, you know, you don't say, you know, look at this Derek Bell book or look at this Delgado book. That's not going to inspire anybody to convert to Islam. You read critical race theory in order to deals with the realities of structural racism in society. And so I think the bigger question is that white Muslim who converted to Islam after previously wanting to blow up a mosque, is he prepared to deal with the realities of addressing structural racism absent an interrogation of critical race theory?
I think that you can criticize structural racism without being committed to critical race theory.
I think that particular white Muslim,
yeah,
you think he can that by means of just going after previously wanting to blow up a mosque and somehow converting to Islam, that he's prepared to deal with the realities facing black communities?
Yeah, he can talk to you, he can talk to other black Muslims, he can talk to other racial minority Muslims who are not academics, who are not, you know, you don't need to, like, I don't understand, like, why do you need to read critical race theory to be able to recognize that blacks are put in prison at disproportionate rates to whites? Why do you need to read critical race theory to recognize that Planned Parenthood and these abortion centers are primarily in black neighborhoods, killing black babies? Why? You don't need to be a critical race theorist. You don't need to read Delgado. You don't need to read his book on critical race theory. You don't need to understand. The thing that makes it critical race theory is because it's bringing in certain kinds of other philosophical commitments, like standpoint epistemology, like this opposition to hierarchy, like this hermeneutics of suspicion, All of these things are part of what makes it critical race theory. Otherwise, it's just there's anti-racism, and there's many different thinkers and many different contributors, Muslim and non-Muslim, to that entire discourse that are not necessarily critical race theorists.
Do you think you can have this critical race theory from an Islamic perspective?
It wouldn't be critical race theory. It'd be something else.
How would you say that?
Because it would fundamentally go against the core assumptions, the core pillars of critical race theory.
What way?
It's not going to be perspectival. It's not going to be standpoint epistemology. It's not going to have this opposition to hierarchy. It's going to recognize the value of submission.
So you conceded earlier in your analysis of the history of critical race theory that a part of standpoint epistemology is true. You disagree with the accesses of it. You agree in terms of racial. You agree that racial hierarchy is bad. That racial hierarchy is against Islam, but nonetheless, Islam isn't in opposition to all hierarchy, but Islam is in opposition to certain forms of racialized hierarchies within European settler colonies. And so for me, critical race theory from an Islamic perspective would accesses of standpoint epistemology, of being against all forms of hierarchy, of being against all forms of or advocating in terms of intersectionality, and it would just be an Islamic agenda to combat white supremacy and structural racism, which are in fact realities. I believe that Derek Bell makes important political insights that you can read with a critical mind. So, for example, Derek Bell had experience in working with the NAACP, where he wanted to desegregate schools, and after the school segregation was declared to be unconstitutional, Derek Bell looked at it and said, the structural racism within the schooling system is still a reality. And so these are just valuable political insights. There's no need to just say, oh, I'm not going to read W.E.B. Du Bois, I'm not going to read Derek Bell, I'm not going to read Marcus Garvey. These are all non-Muslim, Western liberal kuffar. These are important black political thinkers. Their works may be flawed in some way because, of course, they aren't Islamic, but nonetheless, that's not a reason to not consult their work, to not read their work, and to not engage with it in a critical way. The reason you're able to have a discussion with me on a level that other so-called Muslim critics of critical race theory are not able to have is because you've read Derek Bell, you've read Delgado, and so okay, what we can accept as Muslims, what we cannot accept. You have individuals who are claiming critical race theory is just a secular liberal plot to undermine Islam. It's not. It's a sincere attempt, people coming out of a post-Jim Crow era, to deal with the realities of structural racism. You have people in the Muslim community claiming critical race theory of the kuffar. It's liberal, and I pointed out ways in which critical race theory is critical of liberalism. And so, of course, it's good to be educated.
Well, did I say that we shouldn't read these books? I didn't say that.
You said in terms of the white Muslim, the example that I gave you in terms of the white Muslim, you said, why does he need to read?
I say it's not necessary. That's why the point that I was making is that it's not critical. Like, it's not something that you have to do to be able to oppose this kind of racism and the structures of oppression. You don't have to read that, and you don't have to be apprised of that literature. You don't have to fall into one school of thought. You can get the same results, and you can get the same kind of analysis from purely other means, including just purely Islamic means. But that doesn't. But I didn't say that. No, Muslims should not. We should boycott this kind of work. We should not be aware of it. No, of course. If you're going to be able to, especially if you're Muslim intellectuals, have to be familiar and have to be well versed in these different ideologies if they're going to be able to converse with them and understand them and talk about them. I'm always advocating more literacy, but there's a difference between being literate and having that kind of familiarity with the material and then advocating for it or imbibing it or promoting it, right?
I would agree with you on that level. But listen, even if you say we can come to the same knowledge from alternative means, and I would agree with you, but even in terms of accessing the realities of knowledge from alternative means outside of critical race theory, for example, how do you come to the conclusion that the prison industrial complex is real? How do you come to the conclusion that schools are just as segregated as they were during the era of the Prince's Board of Education? A lot of the literature, a lot of the academics, a lot of the people who do those studies, not all Muslim. Their studies aren't all based upon their sociology studies. They're secular. They're not all based upon Islam. And what I'm saying is we shouldn't just all wholesale dismiss any form of political insights by virtue of it being
I didn't advocate.
coming from not.
This is, you're not arguing against me. You're arguing against someone else that I don't know. Because I nowhere have said that we should just disregard. In fact, I explicitly said that we shouldn't disregard. But I'm saying there's a distinction. Is it necessary? Do we have to have this literature in order to be able to combat structural racism? Malcolm X
How would you tell that white Muslim he should come to the reality that schools are just as segregated today as they were?
Yeah, he can. He can. He's. I don't know that particular brother, but a Muslim could take a deep look at history, to become a legal scholar, to be able to go through the books of history and recognize injustices that occur without cracking Derek Bell's book open or Delgado's. Yeah, of course it's possible. How can you deny that's not possible?
What other history books will you look open to? Is all that scholarship done from an Islamic perspective, or do you have to, in somewhere in that journey, come across something that's outside of Islam, and do you just reject it only on that basis?
No, like you can, like I said, you can refer to. It's not necessary. You can refer to. Malcolm X didn't have access to critical race theory because that came after his time period, after he had died, right after he was assassinated. So how is Malcolm X critiquing structural racism?
Had experiential knowledge, but you're critiquing when you critique all forms of standpoint epistemology. Malcolm X is somebody who grew up in the community, was very attuned to the realities of Black life. That white Muslim who converted to Islam, he doesn't necessarily have the same perspective.
How do you know? Like, how do you know that a white Muslim can't have grown up in the projects? He can't have had that kind of experience? Why?
So now you're arguing for standpoint epistemology, because you're saying that a white Muslim who grows up in the projects is now going to have, more insight in terms of the Black condition. What about a white Muslim who doesn't grow up in the projects? How is that white Muslim going to come to the reality that structural racism exists in American society?
No, his experience. He's able to recognize structural racism because of his experience within a community and within a context. That's what I'm saying. It's not because he's white.
White Muslims should come to the reality that structural racism exists through experiences in.
They can. It's possible.
It's possible. Okay, how do we make... You do agree that learning about structural racism and combating structural racism, that is something that Muslims should do, correct?
Yeah, they should do it. But it's not necessary. It's something that couldn't be achieved without going through a certain kind of set of books, without following a certain set of academics who are critical race theorists. You can come to those. Is it beneficial? Like, can you benefit? Will it make it easier for you? Well, it depends. It depends if you have the Islamic grounding to be able to identify, when you read Derek Bell or Richard Delgado, to be able to recognize what is compliant with Islam and what is not. So if a Muslim doesn't have the Islamic learning and the correct aqidah to be able to do that, then no, I absolutely do not recommend that they get into critical race theory, because they're going to be confused. They're going to fall into perspectivalism. They're going to fall into this opposition to hierarchy. They're going to make these kinds of mistakes. And that's the danger. That's exactly the danger that I'm trying to argue against.
So I read critical race theory. My iman is fine. I believe that there's no God but Allah, and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is his messenger. So again, I would just like more.
Aqidah is more than that, right? So I'm not trying to say that you have a problem with your aqidah. I don't know you. I don't know like what you believe and so forth. I've read some of your work and they seem fine to me from an aqidah point of view. But we're talking generally about Muslims. Okay, I'm not going to hand a Muslim brother who is weak in his faith and doesn't understand some of the deeper points of aqidah that every Muslim needs to know. I'm not going to hand him Introduction to Critical Race Theory and have him read it and say, this needs to be the first thing that you do in order to combat structural racism. First, you need to get right with God. You need to get right with your deen, with your religion, and understand what is justice, what is the pursuit of justice. Ground yourself in Islam. Then of course someone can benefit when they have that grounding from these academic works, no doubt about it. And I'm not advocating that we throw everything in the trash just because it's coming from a secular standpoint. No, we can benefit, but what's the priority?
I think one of the dangers of Muslims not being fully acquainted with black political thought, of which critical race theory is a genre of, is you have individuals who are reinforcing a white liberalism. You have individuals in the Muslim community like Hamza Yusuf, for example, who believes that, what about all this black on black crime, and enforcing white liberal talking points when it comes to issues of structural racism. You have individuals who, for example, in critiquing critical race theory, fully engage with it to even critique it in the first place. So coming back to that white Muslim Marine who converted to Islam, what would be your in-depth strategy for him to, one, be fully acquainted with structural racism and to combat it? If you say he doesn't need to read Derek Bell, then he can read history books. Again, some of those history books are going to be written by black people who are Christian. Are we going to say, there are Trinitarian assumptions underlying, this historical analysis?
Well, we don't know. First of all, just because it's a white guy doesn't mean he's ignorant and he isn't aware of these things. Okay, I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that's an appropriate assumption about who this brother is. I'm not saying he is educated in this or he's not.
He was about to bomb a mosque. He was about to kill little.
Yeah, that was in his past. So we don't know what he has studied after becoming Muslim and what he's learned. So why are we making assumptions about who's ignorant? People shouldn't make assumptions about others. In some of your writing on me, you characterize me as being ignorant and not knowing anything about critical race theory and being superficial in my knowledge. But that was a mischaracterization. You don't need to assume about other people's knowledge just because they're white or they're not black. So we don't. So just assume that he doesn't know. Just assume that he. Well, let me finish, brother. Let me finish. You asked me a question. You asked me a question, so let me finish the thought.
Facing black people.
Let me finish the thought, and then you can respond. Okay. So first of all, we don't know the brother's level of knowledge of racism, and we don't know his life experience. We can't learn that from a 5-second or 20-second clip. The thing is that if he wants to be able to address racism, if he wants to address injustice, okay, that's something that he wants to pursue. He can learn in many different ways. I'd say the first priority is to ground yourself in Islamic aqidah, to the Islamic understanding, conception of justice, okay, truth and justice and so forth. Then when he has that grounding, then there's many different avenues. There's not one path, okay? Just because I've gone through a path, you've gone through a path, that's not necessarily everyone's path. And I don't see how that path has to go through a particular set of academics and a particular academic theory. Otherwise, you can't combat structural racism. That doesn't make any sense, because there are many people who are combating structural racism in the context of America and white versus black. Also in the context of the East, white versus Arab, white versus Turkish, white versus South Asian. Okay, all of these kinds of structural racisms exist, and it doesn't require Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Mari Matsuda, all of these different critical race theories, Kimberly Crenshaw, to be able to combat that or to be able to recognize that. Okay, it's not that hard for the oppressed person. Okay, this is something that is coming from secular academia, actually, that the oppressed person doesn't recognize that he's being oppressed. He needs the academic. It might be a black academic, it might be a white academic, to tell him, oh, you're being oppressed. Oh, this is how structural racism works, because you're too stupid to figure it out. You have to have this kind of academic credential. I don't accept that at all.
To respond, first you critiqued me for saying I'm making assumptions regarding white Americans, regarding this particular brother. There are some empirical data to indicate that when it comes to the issue of structural racism, when it comes to particular social issues facing Black Americans that there are widely divergent views, and most white people, for example, do adopt the liberal assumption that there is a post-Jim Crow world, that racial discrimination aren't social realities that Black people have to face. And so that assumption is not necessarily an assumption, it's a reality that we as Black people have been confronted with, and that we know exists, in which there's data to back it up. Second,
you're talking about a specific person. You're talking about a specific person.
Because, again, I'm coming to that specific person, but you made an indictment of my assessment of, oh, you're saying that all white Americans are ignorant. This white man was about to blow up a mosque just because he takes a shahada. Now, all of a sudden, he's going to be some, identify structural racism and combat structural racism. That's something
I didn't say that.
Learn. I'm asking from you, and I'm not asking from it. You're giving a lot of vague propositions as to how Muslims should go about confronting and understanding structural racism. Now, ideally, there should be, Islamic scholarship and Islamic work that deals with how are we going to deal with structural racism in a post-Jim Crow world, and there should be literature, addressing that subject. But just because a white, Marine who's about to blow up a mosque is about to take his, he takes a shahada, he's not going to unlearn all of the racism that he's been taught from birth as a white American. And given the fact that he just was about to blow up a bomb, I would say that Islamophobia and anti-Blackness are inextricably linked, and you don't just get rid of that overnight. And so, again, I'm not hearing any concrete. You're saying, oh,
he converted to Islam many years ago. He's not a recent convert. I don't know. Look, again, I don't know the whole point that I was making.
Head of the mosque after only 3 years. Head of the mosque. Now, to me, this reeks of an inferiority complex among many Muslims.
Right. How do you know how do you know that this brother? Again, we're talking about a particular person. How do you know this brother wasn't going to the masjid every night praying tahajjud, and he is, spending every hour of every waking hour working for that mosque and really earning his position to be present? How do you know those details?
Because given the realities that Black people have faced, there's a Black brother I know who went into the mosque, who went to
that particular mosque. You know a brother that went to that particular mosque?
No, I do not. But
you do not. You don't have that knowledge, right? So then, what is your? See, this is exactly the problem with this kind of critical race theory mentality. You're just because the guy is white, just because this is a white guy, you have all these kinds of assumptions about who he is, how he get to the position that he got into. And he's a Muslim too. It's not like this is a non-Muslim white person who is using some kind of structural racist position to get into where he is.
Muslim who was more qualified for the job?
How do you know there is one in that community that is more qualified for the job?
How do you know that white Muslim was the most qualified?
I don't know that. That's the thing. I'm not making assumptions. You're the one who is making the claim that he wasn't qualified.
I would say, giving the realities in terms of structural racism and employment opportunities, given the nature of the immigrant Muslims, many of whom are anti-Black, many of whom aren't really cognizant of issues in the Black community. In the hood, they love to see a white savior complex. They have this white savior complex where they put the white Muslims on a pedestal who many times disrespect the Black community, i.e. Hamza Yusuf. He's seen as some sort of Islamic scholar, and he's repeating white liberal assumptions about Black people and Black politics. And so, of course, it's not an inaccurate assumption to say many immigrant Muslims have a colonized mentality. You yourself have indicated that.
I'm not denying that. The thing is that you can talk about general phenomenon.
Let me finish. What comes with the colonized mentality is this worship of white people and this worship of whiteness, and this comes with a colonized mentality that many immigrant Muslims who come to this country, who they don't engage with Black people, but they love to see white people. And even this entire video, this entire video of YouTube is just for liberal assumption. A white guy about to blow up a mosque, takes shahada. Congratulations. What about the fact that as a Marine he likely killed Muslims? He was a part of, I won't say likely killed, he was part of the military industrial complex that uphold, U.S. hegemony and world imperialism around the world. Is he going to renounce his U.S. militarism? Is he going to renounce the fact that he's a Marine? And so again, these aren't assumptions. These are something that is based upon concrete information of the reality of the colonization of the immigrant Muslim mind.
Yeah, the point that I'm making is very simple. You have general statements that you can make about the colonized Muslim mind, about infatuation with white people that you find among some immigrant Muslims. Yeah, this is all things that we can talk about in generality. But when we talk about a specific person, we have to have a pause, because we don't know specifics about him, we don't know specifics about his situation, we don't know specifics about his context, and so we have to pause and not apply the generality to the specific case. So if you want to talk about generalities, we can talk all day about generalities, but I'm making a point about, listen, let me finish what I was saying. We can talk about generalities and general phenomenon, but we can't say specific things about that person, and you can't say specific things about me like you did in your blog post that you are not aware of, because this makes you look bad, basically. Because you said that I was ignorant about critical race theory, I hadn't read about it, I didn't know anything, I had a superficial understanding, and then I came and showed everyone that no, I have studied it, I have read it, I've read the books, I've read the individuals, and I'm not ignorant, and no, I don't have a superficial knowledge of that. So you're wrong about that. You're wrong about your assessment of me. So that's a simple example, and then this is why we can talk about the general phenomenon without implicating specific individuals. Now, one thing that I want to talk to you about before we are finished with the conversation is, how do you understand the fact that so many of the critical race theory advocates consider LGBT a minority, and even now the transgendered as a minority who are also being structurally oppressed? What does your understanding of critical race theory have to say about that?
Before we get to that issue, I want to do a follow-up on the whole Marine issue. Do you believe that white Marine was a white supremacist prior to taking his Shahada and wanting to blow up a mosque?
I think he said that, yeah. I think he admitted to that.
So do you think his Shahada automatically sort of eviscerated all of his white supremacy and racism that he had?
It may have. I don't know. That's the power of the Shahada. That's the power of... This is why you can't have a secular materialist understanding of how humanity works. Like the Shahada, saying La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, has the power to transform your heart, okay, and completely change it. Did that actually happen to this brother? I don't know. Allahu alam. Allah knows the state of the heart, not me.
We know that there's concrete examples of people who are Muslim.
Okay, talk about those concrete examples. Don't talk about this guy.
There are concrete examples of Muslims who are Muslim reinforcing anti-blackness, reinforcing social policies that are detrimental.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You want to talk about Hamza Yusuf and what he said? Let's talk about, because that's written record. He's on record of making certain statements about black on black crime. We could analyze that and we can talk about that, because that's all public knowledge. We don't have to delve into a person's heart to know whether the Shahada wiped out this or that.
My basic intention is that while the Shahada is powerful, simply because you enter into the fold of Islam, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're incapable of perpetrating acts of anti-blackness. And
yeah, I agree. It's you can be a Muslim and be a racist. Yeah, I know that. I agree.
Okay. In any case, what I see the value of critical race theory is that I work in inner city communities. I do my best to talk to brothers in the community about Islam, about the legacy of Malcolm X, how Islam can empower their community. And what I find very powerful from critical race theory is that it provides a sort of, for me to like politically assess the communities that I'm dealing with. Look at, this schooling district. Well, what is the school? What is the history behind, this poor schooling system? Or look at the gangs within these communities. How did these gangs form? What's the link between racialized poverty in this community in the larger system of white supremacy? And so my initial appeal to critical race theory as a Muslim was that it sort of provided a sort of political analysis as to certain conditions within certain neighborhoods that I'm in, and certain neighborhoods when I teach Islam. And you will find that when you are more in tune with the political realities that I face, which I've garnered, knowledge from reading critical race theory, is that you're more able to relate to brothers. You can speak to Islam to them in a way that is more politically empowering. And these are all insights that I've garnered from critical race theorists, such as Derek Bell, letting them know that structural racism didn't end with civil rights legislation, letting them know that structural racism is still a reality, and here are the various ways that it's manifest. Critical race theorists are the ones who are producing, the most scholarship in this area, and so that's why I personally consult their works. Now, I do agree with the fact that analysis of structural racism should be done from an Islamic perspective and an Islamic agenda, and that's something that I myself hope to do.
Sure. Yeah, so this brother Irfan Farid makes a great point about the Shahada. He's saying that Umar, radiallahu anhu, before he became Muslim, he wanted to kill the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was planning and plotting and had the intention to actually kill the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he became Muslim and he became one of the greatest Sahaba. So this is a good example of how the Shahada can change a person's state.
I'm reading from the bill where he says, he points to a Sahaba who, even after taking the Shahada during the time of Muhammad, peace be upon him, where there was an incident when Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, was, insulted on a racial basis. And so, again,
I'm not denying that Muslims can be racist. That's not the point. The point is that just because someone has a racist past doesn't mean that they're currently racist after they become Muslim. Like, you can't make that kind of determination about a specific person. Anyway, so let's move on past this because we don't have much time.
Can I ask you one more question?
Go ahead.
Thing to say in terms of what I've just outlined to you in terms of the benefits that I personally garnered from critical race theory, and how I believe that being informed by the insights of critical race theory can help Black Muslims be more effective in terms of with brothers who on the streets who aren't Muslim, the political realities facing their communities.
Yeah, so I'll repeat what I said earlier. I think that if you have a grounding in Aqidah, you have a grounding in Islam's conception of justice and race and so forth and racism, then yes, you can benefit from a wide range of different works. Not all of them are within critical race theory. One of the things that I benefited a great deal from when I was still an undergraduate student and still trying to understand the way the world works is the work of an author named Glenn Greenwald, and he's a journalist and he's non-Muslim. And he's not Muslim. And
did he write it from an Islamic perspective?
No, he didn't. And so I was able to benefit from his work, but I had a grounding in Islam before benefiting from that work. He's not a critical race theorist, but you can benefit. But he does write about structural racism, and he does write about how the law and executive policy is structurally oppressive to certain groups, including Muslims. And so I benefited from that analysis. And as I said earlier, you can benefit from critical race theorists, but you have to recognize the downfall, the problematic aspects of it, and be careful not to fall into those kinds of pitfalls, like standpoint of epistemology, the opposition to hierarchy, and so on and so forth. So now my question to you was, how do you reconcile the fact that many critical race theorists are actually very pro-LGBT rights, pro-transgenderism, and they justify it using the same kind of structural racist arguments? They argue that the straight, white structure, cis is another term, cis, CIS, that the law is inherently straight, white, cis, and so this is a big oppression to LGBT, and this is something that we have to fight and combat. How would you reconcile that?
So I would say that critical race theory is a particular legal analysis that says structural racism continued to manifest itself post-Jim Crow, and it shifted in its modus operandi. And those basic premises do not inherently make one accept other sort of left-wing ideologies. And if it's true that many critical race theorists advocate, for this. Can you point to some examples?
Yeah, like Mari Matsuda. She's one of the founders of critical race theory, along with the Delgado, Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw is another example. If you can go onto their Twitter feeds, you can read some of their articles where they do say that, look, LGBT is another minority group who is suffering from structural oppression. It's not just focused on blacks. That's the thing. You have all these different minority groups that also are facing the same kinds of problems that blacks face. Different policies, different laws, different kinds of history, but it's still the same kind of oppression. Yeah. I mean, I can give you screenshots of it too.
There are critical race theorists who, for example, critique how the white left politics have subsumed the unique focus on the need to focus on the oppression of black people and the structural racism that they face. And as I've said from the beginning of this discussion, in terms of the value of critical race theory are those basic premises that I pointed out to you. And that does not necessarily entail that in the same way you can adopt Martin Luther King's belief that, we need to combat the triple evils of racism and militarism and classism without adopting, Trinitarianism. You can take the benefit in terms of the legal analysis of, the realities of structural racism.
That's fine. Like, the thing is that I'm just pointing out that you have people who are central to critical race theory who are also advocating for these ideas, and they're advocating it because the principles and the foundation of critical race theory leads to these conclusions. And here you can see this person I'm sharing it on the screen. I don't know if you can see, but her name is Mari Matsuda. She describes herself as a writer, a law professor, activist, metalsmith, organic gardener, and a founding critical race theorist. And then you can see the kinds of things that she's advocating. She's advocating homosexuality, queer power, queer identity. Just through a casual search of her Twitter feed, you can see all of these things. Like gay marriage is a big thing that she was advocating for prior to it being legalized in the United States due to a Supreme Court decision. So, I mean, this is one example. Black Lives Matter and what has happened.
I would just simply push back on the perspective that critical race theory entails adopting all of these left-wing.
I mean, you can say that, but you haven't shown that that's the case. I've shown you that here is one founding member of critical race theory.
Liberal co-option and the challenges to black studies under intersectionality by Tommy Curry. He's particularly pushing back against how intersectionality, for example, doesn't take into account how heterosexual black men are uniquely oppressed in terms of how their position vis-a-vis white women. And so you're really homogenizing critical race theory thought. And again, we can, as Muslims, my basic premise is that we should accept the analysis of how racism shifted from de jure to de facto. We should accept the basic analysis of how structural racism, for example, continues to manifest itself in a post-Jim Crow world. None of that entails me adopting any sort of Islamic morals or any sort of ethics that goes contrary to the Islamic worldview. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that fighting structural racism should be the main issue or, a huge concern for the Muslim community, like that's something that is also debatable. I don't think
you don't think that's true that black people who were brought here in the holds of slave ships, forced into various segregated neighborhoods, and you're saying that you don't think racial justice and fighting racism should be our primary concern?
No, it's not our primary concern. Our primary concern is to be Muslims and to worship Allah.
This is where we got to lose this discussion because, listen, we as black people, as black Muslims, we've been dealing with the realities of living in a post-Jim Crow world and dealing with the realities of the aftermath of black code. And so really, you're not even an authority on this topic. Black Muslims who are we live in neighborhoods that are directly impacted by structural racism and by white supremacy. So who are you to say that we shouldn't be combating structural racism in our communities?
And this is standpoint epistemology. Just because I'm not
You
black, I haven't. Wait, let me finish. I'm gonna have to cut you off.
Explain yourself as to why.
I'm gonna cut you off there. So, just because I'm not black does not mean that I don't have a history of experiencing structural racism as well. There is something called colonialism and the colonial, takeover of the Muslim world, to which my family and my ancestors were subject. And so to say that just because that I am not black, I do not understand structural racism, this is exactly the standpoint epistemology coming from critical race theory that is so toxic and it causes all this kind of confusion that Brother Muhammad is demonstrating so clearly. So, and when I say that fighting structural racism is not the primary goal of Muslims, well, of course, that's not the primary goal of Muslims. And if you do think that, then you do have a problem with your aqidah, because the primary goal of Muslims is to worship Allah. That is our purpose as human beings, is to worship Allah. That is our primary goal and concern. And when you look at what the scholars, the ulama, have identified as the primary enemies of humankind, human beings aren't even in the top 4, right? Non-Muslims and oppressors, human oppressors, are not even in the top 4 enemies of humankind. Who are the top enemies of humankind? This is why I come back to over and over again in Muslim Skeptic Live, because we have to reprioritize. It's not the racist. The racist is not the main enemy of the believer. The main enemy of the believer, 4 things. You have the nafs, you have dunya, you have hawa, and you have shaitan. Okay? These things. You have the nafs, the self, the self-aggrandizing self, the self that is that lends itself to arrogance and self-satisfaction and self-love. This is the nafs. This is one of the main enemies, far more destructive enemy than the racist. All the racist can do is oppress my body and kill me and kill my physical body. But what about my soul? Right? What about the soul? Well, the nafs oppresses the soul. The nafs is what can threaten the akhirah. Okay, so the nafs is enemy number 1, right? Enemy number 2 is dunya, right? Dunya, the worldly life, material possession, greed. This is the other huge enemy that will threaten the afterlife, your akhirah, right? Number 3, hawa, your desires, right? Shahwa, your passions, your lusts, and trying to justify engaging in lust. This is what threatens your akhirah. Much more dangerous than the racist. Much more dangerous than Donald Trump. Okay, and then number 4, shaitan. Okay, the avowed enemy, the clear adu, the clear enemy of humankind. Much more dangerous than Donald Trump. Much more racist than these structural racists that we have been talking about. So yeah, these are the enemies. And then also you have the unjust, you have the oppressors. Yeah, of course, I'm not saying that they're not enemies. They are. They should be opposed and they should be fought. But when you don't have priorities right, when your mind is not right, then you fall into all kinds of deviance. And this is why Aqidah is so important. This is why having your understanding of the world needs to be set according to Islam, not according to what these critical race theorists are saying based on their secular thought process and and these ideas that they're propagating in their work. So this was a conversation. Thank you to Brother Muhammad for calling in and providing his thoughts. Clearly, we have some deep disagreements and we have some areas of agreement. I hope that you benefit from the conversation. I'm going to address some comments and questions right now. So if you typed a comment or you have a question that you really want me to address, just retype it so I can see it within the feed and I want to address those things. And then inshallah, that will be Muslim Skeptic Live for this week. And then I'll see you again next week, inshallah. Okay, so let's see. Brother Saad says, in essence, the rights of Allah come before the rights of man. Yeah, of course. We have to be concerned with what Allah wants of us first and foremost. Okay, within YouTube. Brother Waqar says, African American Muslims must develop a new culture that is not based upon racist Jim Crow notions of identity and race. This means that we have to think objectively and critically about race. I agree with that. Political Skeptic asks, how should Muslims deal with critical race theory? Just watch this video to see how I deal with it. And then you can also, I'm going to be publishing an article this week summarizing my critiques of critical race theory, and you can go to muslimskeptic.com to read that, inshallah. IJ says, I am African and I agree more with Daniel than Muhammad. Hakim. Let's see. And then Abu Respect says, the average Muslim is not able to distinguish between the beneficial information and the kufr ideologies within critical race theory books. Yeah, I think that there is an issue. Like, clearly you have Muslims who think that they're solid in terms of their aqidah, and then they start reading critical race theory and they have all of these wrong ideas about their priorities and what Muslims should be focused on and what is a minority. That's why you have many Muslims who adopt this kind of critical race theory mindset, and then they end up marching in the Women's March, marching in pride parades, advocating for all kinds of un-Islamic things. Things that are clearly kufr or clearly contrary to Islamic values. Why do they fall into that? It's because they've adopted an ideology. They've adopted this kind of mindset from a secular source, and then they're not able to distinguish the correct aspects of it and the false aspects of it. And so it's better for the preservation of your iman, for the preservation of your Islam, to just not confuse yourself, to not delve into things that are going to cause that kind of confusion. And unfortunately, the thing is that many of these Muslim speakers and popular du'at and so forth, they are constantly mixing in these ideologies, liberalism, feminism, social justice mentality, critical race theory, into their dawah, into their teaching of Islam. And so they're actively causing problems, right? And an example of that is, how many khutbahs have you heard? Or how many talks have you heard or lectures have you heard from popular speakers that say that, oh, Islam is about peace, Islam is about freedom, Islam is all about emancipating, and that's what true freedom and liberty means. So they're using liberal language, they're using these kinds of terms, and then the Muslim hears that and says, oh yeah, well, Islam is about liberty and Islam is about freedom. And they adopt that because they've heard it over and over and over and over again. And why did the speaker use that kind of vocabulary? Because the speaker is trying to appeal to the masses, and the speaker is trying to create this consonance and say that, see, Islam is just perfectly compatible with the Western world. Islam is perfectly compatible with Western culture. It's all, everything is a happy picnic, and we're all lovey-dovey, hallelujah, kumbaya, right? This is their mindset, and there's a reason, a political reason, why they're advocating this kind of assimilationist mindset. And so they're talking Islam is about love, Islam is about peace, Islam is about freedom, and these are distortions, right? And it's using some of this liberal and sometimes even Christian mentality, Christian ideology. And then the Muslim thinks, oh, see, Islam is all about love, Islam is all about peace, Islam is all about freedom and liberty. And then they read something in the Quran where Allah is saying something that is contrary to freedom. Allah is talking about, milk yamin as a very straightforward example. Allah is talking about submission, and how our entire purpose, the entire purpose of creation of human beings, is to worship Allah. Ubudiyya, to be an abd, to be a slave. And so you read that causes a problem. Or you read some kind of a work of fiqh, you hear a certain hadith, you read a certain narration that is contrary to this ideal of freedom, that's contrary to this ideal of peace, is contrary to this ideal of democracy. And then this causes a crisis of faith. It causes shubuhat, it causes doubts, because all you've been hearing over and over and over again are these platitudes about Islam being about freedom, love, etc. Okay? So this is causing confusion, and it's causing doubts. And it's because people are mixing things that shouldn't be mixed. So this is our sorry state, unfortunately. Okay, Political Skeptic asks, how do you deal with Muslim activists who do great work when it comes to Islamophobia and racism, but are adopting problematic aspects of critical race theory? Do you advise privately? You can advise privately. If it's an individual activist that you know, and you know that person, you can advise them privately. You can suggest things. If it's an activist that just insists and continues to promote wrong ideas and to contradict Islam, then you can also tell other people about it and warn other Muslims about the harm of this activist and what they're promoting. And there's nothing wrong with calling someone out, especially someone who is a public figure and someone who doesn't seem to find any problem in what they're doing. Yeah. All right, so inshallah, that will conclude this installment. Just want to emphasize as a closing note that many of the things that critical race theorists point out about subjugation of blacks, I agree with, and I do think that the black community continues to be disproportionately targeted by the legal system, by the social system, by the economic system, by the media. And there are so many examples of this that critical race theorists point out. But others who are not associated with critical race theory also have pointed out and have argued. And so no problem with those things. Muslims should be aware of those. But there's also many aspects of critical race theory that are problematic, and if we adopt them as Muslims, it can lead to doubts, it can lead to problems in our faith, as I explained. So inshallah, hopefully you benefit from this conversation. Hopefully now you know more about what critical race theory is and our position on it as Muslims. If you have something that you think I missed or you disagree, please feel free to comment in the comment section of this video. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Check out muslimskeptic.com where we have all kinds of analysis and information from myself and other authors on these kinds of issues and these kinds of intellectual debates. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again. Jazakallah khair to you, Brother Muhammad Hakim. I showed his website. He has a blog on the screenshot while he was speaking. But you can also check out his work, and it'll be linked in the comments or in the description as well. So I will see you very soon, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.